The race is on, and amid the reports about Max Verstappen considering retirement, we ask how likely this really is and what, if anything, F1 can do about it. And we tackle listener questions on Red Bull's disappointing form, McLaren 2007 similarities at Mercedes, and much more. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me with all the answers are Josh Suttill and Nelson Valkenburg. Well, today we're going to focus on listener questions from the Race Members Club. If you're interested in joining, click the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and have a search to find out more about that. But there's only one place really we could start, given it's the big story that's rumbling around at the moment. It's perfect. We have Nelson, who of course commentates for F1 on Dutch television. So the first question, Nelson, from Alex Hinley: will Max retire at the end of the season? Definitive answer, please.
If he doesn't get close to what he wants, and that's to be heard, to be understood, and to be listened to, then I believe it is a real possibility that he can go.
So that begs the question, what exactly needs to change? And is it correct that it's primarily more about just F1 itself and the way it is and his enjoyment than it is the car?
I think it's twofold. Of course, he's very much not happy with the way F1 has been going for, well, maybe the past decade, to be fair. But this year it's compounded by the fact that he is really not enjoying driving the Red Bull Ford as well. If that car would have been competitive, his feeling wouldn't have changed about F1, but it would have been more manageable through a weekend. Then it's just let's get on with the job, and it is what it is. But I think the overriding feeling for Max is that if you move away from what F1 needs to be, he will not want to be in F1. And that started way earlier with cars getting heavier and more managing on tires, etc., etc. But now the way you drive an F1 car is so far removed from what all of these drivers have ever learned. The basics of driving a car fast do not apply anymore, and that just does not work for him.
And Max has hated it from the start, it seems like. You know, as soon as he had those first runs in the simulator, it was back in kind of 2023, about 3 years ago, he just seemed to not be a fan, and that's been the case ever since. And I guess it would be a damning indictment of, you know, the current state of F1 if its best driver was to leave. You know, F1's all about the best drivers in the world. And if you don't have Max Verstappen, you don't have the best drivers in the world in your championship. So I think it's a real worry for Red Bull, real worry for F1 itself as well. But yeah, one of its biggest stars has been disenchanted for so long. And like Nelson said, I think it's fundamental to what these rules are about. Because if you ask Max how to fix them, he says, you know, get rid of the battery and let's have full internal combustion engine. And that's not really a realistic thing for F1 to achieve. So I think it can fiddle around the edges and improve stuff, but making a fundamental change to make Max stay is going to be a very, very difficult thing to do.
And I don't think they need to go down the route of bringing back a V8, etc., for him to find his bearing again and find his feet again, but it just needs to be about breaking the latest, getting the best turn in, finding the grip and going on throttle again. And if it's not that, then why is he there? He's not interested in that. And I think it speaks in his favor that he's been so consistent on this. And because he has been, it has opened the door for other drivers to follow suit. You see it with Leclerc. Leclerc was very noticeable in Japan, how incredibly over it he is. And Lando Norris the same. So all your assets are moving in the same direction. But as Josh says, losing your arguably best driver is a problem. Your best asset, that is a problem.
And I'd say completely unprecedented, because I've seen other people point to, you know, Fernando Alonso went on sabbatical, Kimi Raikkonen went on sabbatical. I don't think it's the same thing though if Verstappen leaves, because, you know, take for example Alonso, you know, he left because there was no route to a top team. It wasn't really a reflection of F1 at the time. It was a reflection of Alonso's options. You know, Max has other options, which I'm sure we'll come on to. This is more, not, I don't think, a reflection of, you know, how Red Bull started this era, but very much a reflection of F1 itself. And that wasn't the case with Raikkonen or Alonso. It'd be more like if Ayrton Senna would have left in the early 90s or Schumacher at the peak of his, you know, F1 dominance. It's like I say, a real kind of a real bad luck for F1 if this does transpire.
Especially because they may have created a situation for, well, not even May, F1, the FIA, all the stakeholders have created a situation where their prime assets, including Verstappen, are unhappy with the state of the sport. And I take very seriously the comments, but I also admit that they were probably made in a moment where he's very emotionally over it. But the next few weeks and what F1 comes up with are going to be vital to whether he stays or not.
Yeah, and it's really important to note that more and more drivers have talked about this. The point you made, Nelson, about what they've learned making these cars fast, it's not just about adapting, it's fundamentally that going quicker into, through and out of a corner will cost you lap time. And actually there's a benefit from driving more within yourself. And that's not just in terms of when you've got things like super clipping in fast corners, but in a lot of corners you need to do that. So this is quite a serious thing, and it's why it's far bigger than anything F1's encountered before in terms of the nature of the racing. But Josh, connected to the possible changes, Adam Jackson asks, do you think the fact there's a realistic chance Max takes a break next year, that it will put pressure on F1 to make more seismic changes for next year after the inevitable plaster that will be applied for Miami onwards?
Yeah, firstly, depends what kind of plaster is it, because there are a few... A big one. There are a few levers they can pull for sure, but it's like, how much difference are they going to make? And is that going to, satisfy Verstappen? Because like I say, I feel like this is a product that F1 can refine and make a lot better. And I think the changes that they're discussing, the likes of increasing, you can super clip at a 350 kilowatts, stuff like that, I think can make a good difference and can make qualifying a lot more flat out, get rid of a lot of the things that kind of everyone hates. But like I said before, I'm not quite sure you can make seismic enough changes to fully satisfy Max. But yeah, it should be an important part of their agenda. Of course, they can't base their whole rules formula around keeping Verstappen or making knee-jerk changes to keep him. At the end of the day, he is the best driver and a massive draw for F1, but you can never do that for one driver. The bigger issue is that very few people are happy with this formula, including Max. So you are making changes that are going to satisfy both Max and the drivers and the fans as well. So yeah, they can put this plaster on it, but even for 27, I'm sort of thinking, they can't just ditch this whole formula and go for a V8 or V10 next year. So I don't really see how they can. It's more about that change further down the road, be it 2029, 2030, and kind of bring Max back and accept that this formula we've lost him, but maybe we can get him back for the next rule cycle.
I think if he leaves, he'll never come back. That's what because I think he has lived this life since he was 12, and he needs also an endpoint. That's why he's always said he wouldn't race into his 30s or well into his 30s. What I think is important in this whole discussion is that as long as the drivers are unhappy, the fans are unhappy, because that's basically where they take their cue from. They are fans of the drivers, and you've noticed this already worldwide in viewing figures from what we're seeing from other broadcasters. Some people are really ringing the alarm bells, and there are things they can do for next year. There is an option, and it wouldn't mean bringing back a V8, but it would mean making the battery far less important. The plaster for this year is a start to that, but I think the discussion, not just with Verstappen, but with Leclerc and Norris as well, is simply, we are hearing you, and for next year, it will be better, but bear with us as we make incremental changes this year, and we're going to give our engine power unit providers a hell of a job to create a new internal combustion engine that creates about 200 brake horsepower more. But we all know that this will be necessary. But bear with us, stay with us, and accept that it's not great. But from Miami onwards, let's try to move in unison. That will be the playbook, I think, for F1. To not just keep Verstappen on board, because it's not just about Verstappen. Verstappen is huge in the sport and extremely big in the Netherlands, of course. But every country has their own Verstappen in that respect. And if you start losing those guys, if you start to lose the Norrises and the Leclercs and the Sainz, which they are, look at Sainz's comments, then you lose the value of your sport. I think F1 is learning that the value of their sport is their athletes, most of all.
Absolutely, and what their athletes embody about the brand of Formula One, which is a big part of what they're selling.
And I wonder if they actually undervalued that when thinking about this formula, because you think about the reasons why they concocted this 2026 formula. It was to attract manufacturers, it was to get Audi and to get Honda back, and that was a key priority. But I wonder, in their thinking, did it come in enough that, we should do something that the drivers are going to enjoy, and the likes of Verstappen and Leclerc and Norris are going to enjoy and stick around and actively advocate for, when right now the opposite is happening. And I would, in my view, would take, having Verstappen and Leclerc in my championship over having one or two extra manufacturers, as big as the benefit of having those are. I think the benefit of having a, Verstappen in your championship is even greater than that.
Oh, the big problem was that they were facing a situation where they may only have Mercedes and Ferrari as engine manufacturers. And one of those we know for certain was advocating for these rules, but so were some other parties coming in. And it was made in a vacuum during the COVID period, where it was quite clear that politically, not just in Europe but worldwide, we were moving into a EV only situation. So F1 was looking at being obsolete in terms of the technical challenge, which is the death knell for F1. As much as it is the ultimate driver challenge, it also has to be the ultimate technical challenge. Otherwise, it's just not F1. And they prioritized the technical challenge in a political world that has since changed. And now everybody's looking at them like, why have you done this? It's clear that electrical vehicles only isn't the solution. And the world has moved on, but yeah, the nature of F1 rules means that they're stuck with this.
Yeah, and when it comes to actually conceiving the rules, I've talked about this for quite a long time. It was, right, we get the notional 50-50 split and everything follows from there. They weren't thinking about the on-track product or anything. That was everything about the regs, which is why, for example, I've seen criticism of the FIA and Nicholas Tombassis. Obviously, FIA was involved in doing this, but in the case of Tombassis, he's tried to his job has been to make the best of that, and I don't think he set the 50-50 thing. He's obviously got to sell it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I think a perfect job has been done, but I don't think the criticism lies there. The criticism is in the big picture, combined with the fact that, as Nelson's pointed out, it has changed. But we do also have to sort of, if I may, put on my hat of cynicism, my metaphorical hat of cynicism, as those watching the video version.
What's today's colour of the hat, though?
What would I feel like a cynical hat would have to be a dark colour.
Dark green, I think. A teal, maybe. Is it teal? Is that green?
Yeah, not a bright and credulous colour, let's put it that way. But right. How much of this is just Verstappen lobbying for what Red Bull may want competitively? Because that's always there in the drivers' minds, isn't it? You could take the completely cynical view and it's just Red Bull's not doing that well. He wants to get changes that help Red Bull so he and the team can go out and win more races.
If that's the case, why has he been so consistent since 23 on this? And he is not alone on it. Even, the first few races you heard like the Ferrari drivers saying, oh, this is amazing, we had so much fun. That has gone. Look at how Leclerc spoke during the weekend. Look at the moment with Dominicali and Leclerc in the green room after the race. That look said everything that Leclerc gave Dominicali. And I think the notion that it is to your own benefit, I think you could say that, but I also believe that Verstappen has been so consistent on this, and he is such a lover of motorsport that it doesn't apply in this case.
And I think, Nelson can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's probably one of the most authentic drivers in terms of saying how they feel. I don't think he'd play those sort of games. I feel like 3 years ago he tried it on the simulator, didn't like it, was asked honestly, do you like it or not on the simulator so far? And he said, no, I don't. And then, lo and behold, preseason testing, asked the same question, and he gave the same answer. Like Nelson said, it's that consistency, that authenticity. Maybe I'd question it in the past with other drivers, with Verstappen. Like, come on, this is so clearly what he feels. I guess for Nelson, do you think there'd be any difference if Max was leading the championship? Would that make a difference now? Would we be having the same conversation if after the first 3 races he'd had a Mercedes?
It may have been less aggressive and less fundamental to his deciding to stay in the sport, but the message would be, I have no doubt, completely the same. F1 is wrong. F1 has gone down a path I don't agree with, and it needs to change because I'm losing fun. Winning is part of the fun, of course, but going fast through the corners, ultimately the thing these guys grew up doing and what they are best at. Look at Leclerc; he's probably the fastest qualifier in the field, yet cannot utilize what makes him quick. It's like completely mind-boggling to them.
And it's not quite the same thing. But if you look at sprint races, for example, Verstappen has won way more sprint races than anybody else. And who hates sprint races? Verstappen. It's not like he saw it as an extra opportunity of like, oh, I can win even more races. It's just an authentic opinion.
Yeah, he wants it. I think the ideal version of F1 for Verstappen is 1999. That will not return at any rate, but I think that's where he's coming from.
I'm not sure he'd like groove tyres, but that's perhaps getting into a bit too much detail. There's a question from Michelle Scobie who says Verstappen is looking very unhappy with the Red Bull this year. What team options might there be for him in 27? Well, obviously, we think the most likely thing is he would be, if he left Red Bull, probably to walk away. But if he was to try and move, then Mercedes is the obvious place, isn't it? Because they've courted him before, and it's the place to be at the moment. But there's then the question whether Mercedes would go for him. I still suspect that if Verstappen were willing to do that, which I think right now isn't looking like the thing he's favouring, I think Wolff would still seriously think about it. Yes, Antonelli's come on really well and Russell's a class driver, but there's something in Wolff's mind about Verstappen, isn't there? And any Formula One team would want Max, wouldn't they? Can anyone see that Mercedes door opening, or do you think the set of circumstances mean it's either going to be Max out or Max stays at Red Bull?
I think the situation is a bit too muddled right now, especially with two drivers at the front of the championship in Mercedes. I think George Russell definitely feels like he has to assert dominance quickly, otherwise this discussion will prop up. But yeah, you could also envisage Ferrari with a not long contract term left for Lewis. I think fundamentally they have to change a lot in Formula One first and bring it closer, at least to the experience the drivers had last year, for Verstappen to entertain this. On the other hand, we also know that Verstappen said to Didi Mateschitz on effectively his deathbed that he would stay and finish out his contract with Red Bull. And I know Verstappen well enough to care deeply about such things and about such loyalty. So, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, if I had to guess, I'd say it's Red Bull or nothing, but of course we can't know for sure. I wonder as well, is there an aspect of, is he really going to want to just jump in that Mercedes because it's the best car and just kind of land in the best seat? Because I think one impressive thing he did with Red Bull was just kind of steer that team back to the front of F1, and I think took great pleasure in working together with that team to get it into a really good place. Mercedes is already in a good place. I'm not sure he'd take as much joy from that as what he's been able to build of Red Bull. I think you'd hope get maybe more satisfaction from building that back up, or even going somewhere else with, Aston Martin would be maybe more of a different option. Probably not right now, but I'm sure he'd take a bit more joy in kind of building a team up to the top potentially. But like I say, impossible to know exactly what he's thinking. But I think more likely he'd stay at Red Bull.
Just before we move on, Nelson, can you just give us an idea of how big this Verstappen story is in the Netherlands, in the wider world? Is this kind of one of the big stories that's rattling around in your part of the world over the past few days, kind of that's really penetrated the wider public consciousness? It's not just an F1 story.
Very much so. It's front page news. He is the most successful Dutch athlete in a country that has a lot of them, but right now he is the biggest star in sports in the Netherlands. So obviously every outlet, every bit of media that normally doesn't pay a lot of attention to F1 is paying attention. So it has this oil spill feel that must, and you see this globally as well, that must really, really frighten F1 a little bit. The stakeholders must be looking at this like something they cannot control, a narrative they can't control. So it's big here, but I suspect it's big everywhere.
Yeah, because the bottom line is, as we've alluded to, Verstappen, he is the biggest name in Formula One in terms of the voice who's there for the racing. Hamilton is still a bigger kind of figure. Lando Norris is the world champion. But I think in terms of being kind of perceived as the guardian of pure racing and all that kind of thing, and the current greatest driver in Formula One, Verstappen carries a huge amount of weight, which is why if you're F1, you're desperate to keep hold of him. Right, we're going to move on to some wider questions now, though we're going to start off in the realm of Red Bull because Nelson, Adam Barton asks, how did Red Bull flatter to deceive so much in pre-season testing?
I think it's the nature of the track itself. We were in Bahrain, and the Red Bull is definitely not as competitive a car as we thought in Bahrain. Part of this is sandbagging. Part of this is the ease of harvesting in Bahrain compared to where we've raced right now. What became really clear in Japan is that in isolation the car may look okay-ish, but in a fight, the deployment of the Red Bull Ford energy is such that they can't fight. Verstappen closed the gap to Gasly, and at times was a little quicker than Hamilton, but he just got stuck. There was no way forward. So he was basically in digital dirty air because he was stuck behind Gasly. And you saw this with Lindblad after his poor stop. You saw it with Hadjar as well. Once they get stuck somewhere, that's it. The Red Bull doesn't have a deployment strategy that actually corresponds well with other cars. This is what sets Ferrari apart a little bit, because if the Ferrari gets ahead of the Mercedes, you see a similar situation with Mercedes where they just cannot deploy the power in an efficient way compared to the Ferrari. But it's way worse for Red Bull because also the balance is not there. It was very stark looking on board in Japan to see that it's just understeer and oversteer, and then you have crappy deployment and nothing really worked. But we all came away from Bahrain thinking, well, they must be in the fight. So I think this is a virtue of the track being a little bit more sympathetic to that car and an awful lot of sandbagging.
And also, I would say during pre-season testing, Red Bull stock probably peaked early in the first Bahrain test because of where they were and how they were running, and it was really impressive. But then kind of it came back. I think, if memory serves, in our rankings of the teams, we had them fourth. But we did say there's a clear big four and then the rest, whereas actually, particularly the last couple of weekends, they've been firmly in that midfield group. Josh, a question from Daryl Finch. Given it's a when, not if, Max announces he's leaving F1 at the end of 2026, well, we'll take that as an assumption for this question. Which former Red Bull junior is most likely to replace him? Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon or Carlos Sainz?
Yeah, really, really hard to say. Other teams like Ferrari, you go, Ollie Behrman's going to slot in there. Red Bull, it's kind of like, who's gonna go there? More than likely is going to be an ex Red Bull junior, just because there are so many on the grid. The question mentions Carlos Sainz is probably a decent shout. Obviously, it hasn't gone the way he'd hoped at Williams in the second year, but he is still committed to that project. He could leave next year, so that's kind of one option. Pierre Gasly obviously has an Alpine contract for a couple more years. Again, could he extradite himself? There's a few options there, but it's not really an obvious one to me. I'd say the one good thing is that Red Bull at least has its young driver pipeline a bit more in step now. So, you have a dependable second driver in Isaac Hadjar, who is looking quite good, and Arvid Lindblad is looking good in the second team. So at least that pipeline is looking a bit more decent than about 12 months ago, 24 months ago, when you had, if Sergio Perez was going to be the driver to step up, I'd be a bit less confident. But at least Red Bull has shored itself up there a little bit, but it's also in a really difficult spot because to me there just isn't an obvious replacement.
Out of Gasly and Sainz, who do you guys think is doing the better job at this point? Because both of them seem to be in good form.
Both very similar, yeah. In terms of both having strong seasons, I'd say.
And then the other question, I guess, is who would be best in Red Bull, right? Because I'd probably back Carlos Sainz to be more adaptable to go into that seat, and Red Bull can finally right a wrong from the last 2 years of not signing Carlos Sainz when I think it should have done in 23 and 24 and 25. But yeah, Pierre Gasly is maybe more of a question mark because we know he can do it in the Alpine and kind of rebuilt himself very well in Red Bull's second team. But there'll always be that question mark of can he deliver in a top team, especially in Red Bull, considering how badly it went last time. Sainz doesn't have that same question mark for me because he's gone to Ferrari and proved to be a very, very capable driver fighting for wins and podiums.
To me, Gasly seems like the driver with the highest ceiling, but Sainz reaches his ceiling more often. because he's such a diligent worker, so flexible, so driven, and he has the flexibility in his driving style as well. But we cannot deny how good Gasly has been for the last 9 months. Basically, he's been top notch, and he's destroying the opposition within the team. That's for sure.
I would say Gasly's widened his window as a driver gradually over the years as well, which is very impressive. But I suspect if we're purely looking at past Red Bull drivers, I think it would be they'd take Sainz over Gasly for the simple reason that Gasly failed in Red Bull racing, and regardless of where you stand on that decision, they deemed him to have failed and they pushed him out. Whereas Sainz actually never raced for Red Bull Racing, and in fact he forced his way out of Red Bull because he wasn't getting the chance. So you can argue he failed to get that Red Bull Racing chance, but he didn't actually fail in it, if you see what I mean.
Well, none of the leadership that was there then is there now. So maybe inconsequential how people feel about the Gasly era, short as it was.
Yeah, but also the same with Sainz, because I think there was a reluctance to take Sainz because of the feeling he'd shunned them or something that lay with certain individuals. Right, a question now from Hugh that I'll take. Is Russell looking down the barrel of an Alonso 2007 experience? Is Toto Wolff's repeated cheerleading Francinelli over the past 2 years the basis for a potential fault line in the team? And Scott Harris asks if George Russell is at risk of not keeping his head like Alonso did in 2007. I must admit, I'd not really drawn the McLaren 2007 comparisons, but actually it's an interesting counterpoint. It's a little bit different in that Antonelli has been there for a year, and Antonelli was the number 2 driver last year in terms of the level he was performing at. So Russell's gone into this year in charge. I still think I would expect Russell to get back on top, but my confidence in that has reduced over the past week or so let's put it that way. So it could create some genuine friction. I think, yeah, there is the potential for a fault line in the team, because you can see a scenario where if Antonelli keeps delivering and he pulls away in the championship, Russell starts to feel, oh yeah, he's Toto's boy, he's I'm just the kind of person they've got because they couldn't get Max Verstappen, and it kind of spirals from there, because when things are going badly, then drivers can sometimes sort of multiply these things by feeding in all sorts of other bits. Anyone else feeling those comparisons?
Well, especially if you're waiting for this opportunity with what you thought was the best team when you moved from Williams, and now the opportunity is here. This is what George Russell's been waiting for, and suddenly a driver who he had the measure of last year comes alive, and properly alive. And I don't know if you guys saw this slightly cringy, candid video between Toto and George in a cool down room in the Mercedes hospitality after the race, where they were talking about it and our luck will change, etc., etc. It felt a little bit like cleanup. Ultimately, it's very difficult when you have so much riding on one driver. Remember what Toto said 2 weeks ago when Kimi took his first victory. People said we were crazy, blah. He really felt like he was vindicated. That must feel to George Russell like he has a lot riding on Kimi Antonelli. And ultimately, we saw it last year as well. It is impossible to give both drivers the feeling that they're treated equally, regardless of whether or not you do it. To give them that feeling, as you say, as things spiral, as pressures mount, then to keep that on an even keel is extremely difficult.
The bottom line, though, for Russell is he's got the machinery and the opportunity. If this is not going to be a problem, then you make sure it's not a problem through performance. That's always the answer here. And if Antonelli gets on top of Russell, then it's because he's doing a better job ultimately, and then everything will follow from that. So that's I guess, the thing in terms of not losing his head. He's got to really focus on making sure he's on top of things. And I still think, actually, he is still on top of things. China, there was some misfortune. Australia, he was very strong. Japan was not a great weekend at all, and Antonelli was clearly the stronger driver. But he's just got to go to Miami, say, right, I'm going to assert myself. That is the job, ultimately. And
but
this is his
how do
opportunity.
you assert yourself in a formula where pushing harder leads to a worse lap time?
Well, that's a good question. You've got to find a way, haven't you? And what was interesting is in the first couple of weekends, Russell really was in tune with that deployment side of things. And Japan, it wasn't quite there. He did seem to have a plan and a strategy that it would be right come qualifying, and maybe the setup change kind of covered over that. But there were things like the way he was driving spoon curve that were having implications for deployment on Friday, etc. So that's an interesting question. Has Antonelli kind of learned, and is Antonelli thinking, actually, I can work out how to adapt? Because that's the bottom line. You've also got to do what you can to adapt to these nonsense rules as they are in areas. And if you have to drive slower to go quicker, then you've just got to drive slower. And, we give Russell a lot of credit for his intelligence, rightly so. So that's his challenge. You've just got to find a way. If you don't find a way, you've got the machinery. Ultimately, you've got no excuse.
And he's got the experience. I mean, last year he put together a really solid campaign and had very few off weekends. And you'd expect a second-year Antonelli to have more off weekends than however many years. Russell's been around, 7 or 8 years, but Russell's been around. So he's got to use that to his advantage and maybe accept that some weekends Antonelli will have the edge on him. But if he can have put together a much stronger, consistent campaign, that's where Russell can make the difference, because I'd still expect Antonelli to have some weekends where he gets a bit lost because of his lack of experience.
It's just so muddled, because last year I think we're all in agreement. George was fundamentally the quicker driver, but being fundamentally quicker counts for very little at this point. And that must also do a number on your, let's say, your mental well-being if you're suddenly in the fight for a title. He must come into the season thinking he's the quicker driver, but it counts for very little. Consistency, cleverness, etc. That's what's going to help you now. And I mentally, I must admit, I don't know how you keep an even keel like this.
I think Russell is pretty good on that side of things, so I wouldn't be too concerned about him at the moment. And I think Russell, his tendency will be to kind of dig into the details, get on top of what went wrong in Japan. And there was some bad luck as well. But he can't just look at it and think it was all bad luck, because there were other things as well. So I'm pretty confident in Russell's ability to do that because of what we saw last year. But equally, Antonelli's coming on. So that makes for an interesting battle. Right, Nelson, a question about another driver who could be under pressure from Martin Jones. Is Franco Colapinto living on borrowed time? Gasly is at the front of the midfield, while Franco seems consistently on the receiving end of the biggest pace delta between teammates. And Luke Sherman asks if the gap should have Franco getting a bit uncomfortable.
If there was an obvious candidate to replace him, I would say yes. But right now, I don't really see it. I don't see who they'd replace him with, and
they've got a reserve driver in Aaron, haven't they?
Yes, but you exchange one driver for another without a clear knowledge whether or not that's going to work. We've seen this before at some teams, and it never really works. But he had an okay weekend in China. He was good there. That was fine. But maybe it highlights how good the job Pierre Gasly is doing. Because he has been so good, and he has been good consistently for months now. And it's no longer a bottom of the ladder car, but it's a true midfield leader, that car. Even after they looked really bad in practice in Japan, he still pulls it out of the bag. And it may just refocus how good a job Pierre's doing. But if they have an opportunity to find a driver of a stature that is significantly better, that will do a better job, I know for certain Flavio will be ruthless in the end.
The question said uncomfortable as well. I think that's quite a good word to describe it, because it is an uncomfortable place to be. And also, it feels like with Franco, even on his kind of better weekends, even in China, it feels like he's still starting every weekend on the back foot. He often has a slow Friday. He's often kind of chasing things. And in cases like China, he was able to make up that deficit. And by qualifying in the Grand Prix, he was pretty decently on Gasly's pace. But it feels like he's always chasing things and never quite on top of the car. And that might be to do with experience and a lack of it compared to Gasly, who's well embedded in that team. But it always feels like he's not quite there, and kind of he gets there in the end, but always kind of starting on the back foot, and that just kind of spirals. It's a little bit familiar of something like Mick Schumacher at Haas, and minus the crashes, because Franco's done a good job of not having the incidents so far this year. But in a way, like that driver can get there, and the peaks are really good, but they've got another driver in the other car who's really kind of wringing the neck and getting some good points. And obviously in that case, Haas went out and sought Nico Hulkenberg for the following year to make sure they had two drivers capable of scoring points. And like Nelson said, I wonder if Alpine will be thinking the same. I agree, there's not the driver there right now, but maybe they'll be thinking, is there someone we can put there next year? Because they have sacrificed an entire engine division to make sure that this car is competitive. And I think they've done some really good design work. I mean, credit to Alpine. They've made a really good car this year. Fairly close, I think closer than most people thought they would be, to McLaren, well clear of Williams. So they need to make sure they've got two drivers performing in it. And, right now they've only really got Pierre who's doing the consistently fantastic job.
Feels also a little bit like an unfair discussion, because maybe Franco Colapinto is the one driver I would have thought that would not fare well with this regulation set. He's quite the seat of the pants driver. He just chucks it in the corner and does it all on feel, which is just no longer what this regulation set is about. So I can imagine he struggles more with the consistency, with the deployment strategies compared to other drivers. And yeah, it may be an unfair situation, but yeah, this is what they have to deal with, and he's struggling with that.
Yeah, the bottom line is it's down to him to adapt, isn't it? Even though it's in the car, he did say in Japan he had the same spec and everything as Gasly, so it's a fair comparison. But qualifying pace, I think, is the key for Colapinto, because in Japan his race was going decently. He was undone a bit by the safety car, but that's going to be the key thing, because he can't keep flirting with being eliminated in Q1 and going out in Q1 or Q2 when Gasly's threatening or getting into Q3, because that puts you so much on the back foot. So qualifying pace is critical. And indeed, the key thing here is Fabio Briatore, isn't he? He's not famed for his patience with drivers. There was a quote I noticed they put out in their post-race press release in which Briatore kind of said, yeah, Franco needs to find that qualifying pace, basically, or words to that effect. And usually post-race press releases are very, very, very bland. So if he's actually targeting a weakness of his driver in a press release, you can imagine what might be going on behind the scenes.
He also missed these circuits last year, right? Because that's when he was on the sidelines with doing. So in fairness to Franco, when he goes back to those tracks, he does know, hopefully there'll be a step in performance there.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd give him the season, to be honest. I think you've got to let it play out and see where he gets to. Certainly, I think they should be not thinking about next year until you get to kind of the middle of the year, because they're not at the front of the queue in terms of drivers they're going to be signing. They're not going to be in the market for Max Verstappen or anyone. So I think just kind of say to him, right, we're going to give you time to really show it. We need you to get to this level, and you know that, but do it. And then it comes down to, can Franco Colapinto do it? Same thing as Russell. Different situation, but if you deliver, you keep your drive in 99% of circumstances. There are occasional strangenesses that can lead to that changing, but for the most part, do your job. And the difficulty is working out how to do that. Right, a question from Chirag Shah for you, Josh. Could we recognise the good work Liam Lawson's doing in the background by quietly going about his business and starting to show some point-scoring consistency? I was super frustrated, though, by seeing the mess on the timing screen multiple times, by them showing him last and a minute down and then immediately him popping right back up to where he actually was.
Yeah, I didn't hear Nelson, what was this like commentating? Did you notice that?
Oh, yes. The first time it happened, you thought, oh, he's gone off, etc., etc. And then you see him popping back up. And from that moment on, you know he's got a transponder issue. It's not the first time this happens. But just your instinctive reaction is to draw a line. It's like, oh, he's had a massive issue. And then the moment he creeps back up or is placed back into that top 10 position, okay, we have to be very careful with this. But that's just something you take on board.
Yeah, I don't think there's any transponder bias there. But on Lawson, I do feel sorry for him, because when kind of rating him as an F1 driver, it can often feel harsh because, take for example, we ranked all the driver lineups before the season, and we said Liam Lawson is the weakest lead driver of any team. And that on paper sounds really harsh. It sounds like you're kind of putting him down compared to other drivers. But all that's really saying is when you stack up all the lead drivers, he's not quite as strong as some of the others. What he is still is a very dependable point scorer, someone who's picked themselves up very well from a brutal sacking, 2 races with Red Bull Racing. I mean, we talked about mental challenges earlier. Like, that is a huge challenge to pick yourself up after that and perform straight away. It wasn't like he had a break. He was thrust straight back into the second team alongside Isaac Hadjar a really top performing rookie, and he had to go out there and perform every week and pick himself up. And I think he did that to a decent job last year, and same again this year. There's no easy ride. He might have thought that, I've got a rookie alongside me, maybe there'll be a bit of an advantage there, but the way Arvid Lindblad's come out of the blocks has really put, Lawson on his toes. And I think so far this year he's done a decent job. Japan was a little bit fortunate with the safety car timing, obviously helped him to get into the points, but his China weekend was really good, and I think, like I say, he's still on a great trajectory. It just means that we don't have him in the conversation for top teams, and we say stuff like he might be the weakest lead driver, but again, like I said, we don't mean any disrespect by that. He's still a perfectly dependable point scoring midfield driver.
On the eye test in Bahrain testing, I know, Ed, you saw the same. He was struggling massively, and we sort of, as you do, make snap judgment that he must not be able to deal with this regulation set, etc., etc. That narrative is completely out of the window. He's doing a good enough job. The team's very happy, and fundamentally has a very good relationship with Lindblad. So I think Racing Bulls is just also by virtue of Lawson doing such a good job in a good position. And maybe they just don't need that strong lead driver, since they are the academy team for the Red Bull team. It may not be what is needed from Lawson. These two kids need to gel together and get the maximum out of it. But he doesn't have to assert himself, especially since he's already been at Red Bull and that failed. He just needs to get on with the job and not think about the wider implications of whether or not he's heading to Red Bull.
Yeah, which I think he did. Japan, I actually thought was his best weekend of the season, because although he got out qualified by Lindblad, he made Q3. He had a front wing problem. There was some damage. It wasn't clear where it came from. I'm not sure. I couldn't see direct evidence that it was driver misadventure, but he had a nose change between runs in Q2, and then they didn't have a flap set right because they didn't have a good benchmark for it. So kind of the safety car perhaps paid back a little bit of the bad luck from before. Right, a question from Duncan Bertram. Are you surprised by the lack of field spread, excluding Cadillac and Aston Martin? The gap from first to last at the end of Q1 was just 1.1 seconds. Is this genuine in cause for optimism, circuit specific, or squeezed by the deployment limitations in qualifying? Yeah, I am surprised overall by the lack of field spread. I'm surprised by the fact that if you look on average, Cadillac's 4.6% down on what we call super times, which is just based on every team's fastest single lap of the weekend, regardless of when it's set, as a percentage of the outright fastest. And you can average that out, and it just gives you kind of a ceiling of performance. So even actually the front to back is impressive. And yeah, if you go up to Williams, it's 2.8 behind on average, 2% behind for Haas, which is actually on average the slowest on single lap pace of the midfield teams. That's more condensed than I think. I do think Japan Q1's not a good measure. It's not 1.1 seconds from first to sort of the back of the midfield, excluding Cadillac and Aston Martin, but it's been pretty good. And there's an element, I think, of the power unit dominance is playing a role there as well, because as well as the drivers being limited by those deployment demands, there's certain aspects to which actually a car being stronger in the corners is not necessarily a good thing, given what you want to be doing with the throttle, etc. So I want to see more data on that before we work out exactly how much of that is down to the power unit regulations and how much of it is down to actual chassis differences or chassis similarities. But I actually expect there to be bigger performance differences between the PUs overall. And in terms of single lap pace, it's not very big.
And especially if you look at Cadillac, they were closer to Verstappen after Q1, and Verstappen was to the fastest time of one of the Mercedes. And that, I think they've done so much better than we thought they would. The big test is, can they develop, etc. But the spread isn't as big as we thought, and they seem to be in a happy place. So good for them.
Right, on to our final batch of questions now. And remember, we let our members in the Race Members Club ask questions after every single Grand Prix. If you're interested in the Race Members Club, hit the link in the episode description or head to Patreon, search for The Race to find out more. The first question from Adam Barton Nelson. Do the first three races prove that while flawed, the new rules do provide decent racing?
Oh, you asked this to a kid that grew up in Formula Ford eras. And it doesn't get more... let's say more core motorsport than that. I've enjoyed myself on the Sundays. But if I scratch away at the surface, the flaws are there. But again, I enjoyed myself. And last year's Japanese Grand Prix had very little moments of jeopardy like this year had. So it is the question, do we want style over substance, or is there a happy medium? And as long as these Sundays are mildly entertaining, however fake it sometimes look with accidental overtakes, etc., I think it provides a bit of cover to the powers that be. If we didn't have that, then the screams of change from the drivers would ring even louder. But yeah, mildly entertaining, sometimes quite entertaining. I really rate Leclerc's outside move. The first one was extremely ballsy, loved it. But that was maybe one of the few true motorsport moves of the day. And that's not where we need to be. So yeah, we tried to sell it. We have to sell it as broadcasters. This is our bread and butter as well. And we have to give the people who watch a good time. But in the back of my puristic head is probably the same feeling a lot of the drivers have.
Right, Josh, a question on a related note from Bernhard Wagner. I know you've been over this, but is it not a bit sad to hear the drivers discuss deployment patterns in the cool-down room?
Well, the drivers are reflecting on the race and what dominated the race, the factors that go into a race, and that's why they're talking about those patterns, because that's what formed the race, essentially. So it's kind of by the by, unfortunately. I think the cool-down room is a good feature, so I'm just glad we get to hear what the drivers think afterwards. It's quite genuine, actually, what they say. It's probably like the most kind of authentic conversations they have is in front of a microphone is right after the race.
Right, question from Gareth Anstey that I'll take. Are there rules against moving under regen as well as rules for moving under braking? I'd say it's all kind of broadly covered by the same thing, because certainly if you're harvesting, there's a braking effect. If you're lifting, there's a braking effect. So I would say if you were to move approaching a corner not on the brakes but lifting, that still effectively is moving under braking, isn't it? Because you're slowing. So they can use the same rules, and there's clauses about driving erratically or whatever that you can apply to. And obviously this is talking about the Colapinto Behrman incident. So this is something I think F1 has to think about. I remember during the race when that incident happened, I was exchanging a few messages with Scott Mitchell-Malm about it. And I said, I definitely wouldn't be doing any penalising about this, but I'd definitely in the next driver's briefing be talking about it, because you need the driver ahead to realise that what would have been fine last year, they have to modify a little bit, and you have to be kind of earlier in terms of those moves. And also the overtaking driver has to sort of think about what may happen. So I would definitely say there's mechanisms in the rules that you can in certain circumstances. Just because they're not on the brakes, let's put it that way, doesn't mean you can't be guilty of moving under braking. Let's put it that way.
Imagine being a fly on the wall of that driver's meeting if a race director has to say that to a driver after they're so unhappy with the current regulation set. Also, would have been really F1 to penalize Colapinto for something that is instinctively a race driver's move. Okay, I'm just going to go through the middle. I'm not going to be completely on the line, but I'm just going to make it difficult, and not taking into account the huge closing speeds because of the issue that Colapinto had. So yeah.
Even Ollie Behrman was kicking himself afterwards, and it was interesting. But like, he took quite a lot of the responsibility, and even his team boss Ayakomatsu obviously said he doesn't need to kick himself, but he also said, Franco wasn't at fault. So that was quite an interesting side, because usually in that case you'd expect the driver to be furious, but they're actually just kicking themselves. And like we say, it's a bit more a product of the regulation.
Yeah, and the really important point is this isn't just about speed differences, because there's lots of racing series where you get big speed differences, but it's the fact that there's such a big difference between what a car does when it's at full power with full deployment, when it's at no deployment, when the K's not harvesting, though when you are harvesting, that's such a big difference. And that's the thing. So in multi-class sports cars, if you're closing in on a GT car, it's not going to suddenly halve in power in a given moment. So there is a degree of unpredictability that's way beyond what can be expected, because for racing to work, there needs to be a certain amount of predictability in terms of what people are doing. Right, Nelson, a question from Sue Moorcroft. Publication of Fernando Alonso's autobiography, Racer, has been postponed to December the 17th. Do you think this is an indication of a planned retirement? Retirement would be an opportunity to maximise sales. I have to say, the world of book publishing and deadlines and timelines is very, very odd. So it's probably just in the arcane world of that. But the question of Alonso's retirement is an interesting one.
Well, his life has changed if we're to believe the reporting that has come out of Spain as well. And it's interesting that nobody got a really clear answer from him, especially the Spanish TV tried really hard, but we all assume he became a father of a healthy child just before Japan, and that must put a different spin on things. And where we started off this podcast talking about Verstappen, at the other end of the spectrum is probably Alonso, who stayed in F1 for a chance to redeem himself and get out of the career something more that he wanted. And I can well imagine Alonso looking at this thinking, I could have a lot of fun at Le Mans. I'm still young enough to have another go at Indy because he's that sort of a racing beast as well. They have a lot in common, Verstappen and Alonso, including probably now fatherhood. And I can imagine Alonso thinking hard and long about it. But as you say, to have a book launch date as the bellwether for that is maybe going a bit far.
I guess the key difference between him and Max, as you said earlier, Nelson, Max has achieved everything he wants to and Alonso still hasn't. And I just feel like if you're going to go through all that pain as he has so far, and even in 2026, literal pain to be where he is now driving that car, you just have that thing of if I left now, if I retired now, what happens if Honda does fix its problems, if it does become, makes quite the turnaround, if it uses those new engine equalization rules or the chance to use upgrades and makes a big step forward in an Adrian Newey Aston Martin, even say at the end of next year, could it be in a position where it could be getting podiums, wins? It seems ambitious now, but just on the off chance that it could be, and Alonso walks away from that at the end of the year, I mean, that would just be a really cruel twist and an end. It almost feels like to me it's so bad it's kind of worth sticking around to see at least is there actual progress at least for by the end of this year.
I would have thought the way to stay on for next year is pretty clear because it's not like Aston Martin's going to be powerful in the driver market at the moment. So, yeah, I agree. He will keep a close eye on what Honda are doing. And realistically, with everything Honda's said, almost this year's troubleshooting, isn't it? So we're not going to see a great deal from Aston Martin Honda overall this year. Maybe second half of the season, things will be a little bit better and they'll have a little bit to race for. But, yeah, they're not going to be getting podiums this year or that kind of thing. So he might well think one more year. He's still operating at a good level, but yeah, I think if you're Alonso, you're probably thinking, I'm not sure that this is going to pay off with the success that I was hoping for.
The thing is, it has potentially extended his career, like you said, Ed, because I think if obviously they were getting podiums and wins, probably another driver would have got themselves in there for 2027. But like you say, because they haven't, weirdly, actually, Aston Honda failing has actually potentially extended his career longer than if they'd have succeeded.
Yeah, that's a good point because they were speaking to everybody for the next contract period. And those discussions probably have gone pretty cold.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the confidence level in Aston Martin at the moment on the outside will not be super high. Right, Josh, a question from Susie H. I read that Norris has exhausted his allocation of certain power unit components. Is this true? And if so, how much of an impact will this have on the rest of the season? Or are other teams also struggling and so grid penalties may become more frequent across the board?
Yeah, so I think I'm right in saying he's moved on to his final battery now. The first battery was in, obviously, the DNS in China, and that couldn't be salvaged. Second battery failed in Japan, but potentially could be repairable, so they're going to be looking at that. So he's potentially on his final battery, but potentially could swap to his second one. But yeah, grid penalties, I'm sure, are going to be inevitable for lots of drivers. It's a new era. Reliability problems have been, quite prevalent. I'm not sure if I've expected this level of... I think the main surprise for me is not so much the reliability kind of in races, but before races. I didn't expect to have so many cars not starting. That was probably the biggest surprise to me. And then we have a weekend like Japan and it seemed like things were suddenly quite a bit better. So I don't know if that said more about the circuit. The weekend was luck or was teams making steps forwards, and I'm sure they'll make them in April. But yeah, I'd expect grid penalties, whether or not for Norris or other drivers, I don't know, but you can definitely expect them.
There's a lot of ancillary components failing, which probably goes to show that Aston Martin is not the only team struggling with a lot of vibrations. They've just pushed this internal combustion engine to a point where it's all running at the absolute peak limit. and hydraulics and cooling lines and stuff like that are the things that are going quite often. And what is strange, as you said, is that it appears on Sunday morning. McLaren now twice now, or Saturday morning in there, it's like things suddenly break, or at a warm up things aren't right anymore. And just goes to show what is happening underneath the bodywork in these cars.
Right, and the final question from Kristin is, has there been any official explanation as to why team radio is so greatly reduced this year? Is it purely to protect the image of F1 against drivers complaining about engines? And Marion Smith asked, where are the radio messages? Why are they not broadcast? I'm probably not the best place to judge how many radio messages there are in the main broadcast, because I have about 4 audio feeds with loads of radio messages from all sorts of things. So half the time I don't know where they're coming from. So others, particularly Nelson, maybe better qualified to comment on that specifically. What I will say is, because I do listen to a lot of audio, both live, between sessions, after sessions, and just watching through later on, and given F1 has always tried to put in the messages to kind of add to the coverage and the interest, a lot of the messages are quite just dull and process and deployment and that kind of thing. So, and not kind of complaining about it, but just talking about what people are battling with are doing, what they're doing, etc., what they need to do, throttle position, all these sorts of things. And I actually think that, setting aside any of the other stuff, a lot of those just aren't actually that interesting to put into the main feed. So I can understand that, and F1's policy has always been that it has to be additive to the coverage. But Nelson, what do you think? Is that you're probably the best place to judge if you're getting more or less?
Way less. It was noticeable in Japan. Way less onboards, way less onboard radios. And I think, yes, I agree with you. If it doesn't add to the show, they're not going to show it. But there's a lack of confidence that is starting to show from the broadcast part. Like, let's not show the part everybody's already talking about. Let's not add fuel to the fire. There was this very strange thing with the onboard lap of the pole lap that Kimi had that was missing a part, and you immediately get conspiracy theories there. So that's the environment they are working in now at F1 TV and F1 broadcast. So every broadcaster takes the same feed. We do the same at Viaplay, and it is noticeable that there's just far less onboard radio chatter that is interesting. Whether or not that is because they're censoring it or it's just clearly not interesting, it adds up to the same thing. It's not great what is happening on track.
And if there is any element of filtering, I think it's kind of pointless, because nobody consumes F1 now and sits down and just watches it on TV, and that's the only way they consume F1. People probably have their phone in their hand, they're looking through social media before, after, during the race, and they're kind of consuming it on multiple different platforms where they will see these actual onboard cameras, where they will see other team radios of other people are found and shared everywhere. So if there is any element of filtering, it's just pointless. Just show us the proper products, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that's fine, because that's going to appear everywhere. You might as well show it in the main place where people are watching it. And after the April gap, when we get to Miami and maybe things are better, it's great, because you can show, look, it's better now, rather than just holding all that back until you feel like you have a good enough product after the April gap or next year.
I suspect there may be a certain wariness about dropping in ones, because there's plenty of drivers complaining about deployment not being there and that kind of thing. So there's probably a few emotional messages that haven't gone in. But I'm also inclined to be a little bit careful with criticism of the live feeds, because remember, there's 22 cars out there. There are loads of times over previous years when I thought, that was a really good message. It didn't get picked up by the broadcast. But if you're trying to pick and choose from all of those cars and keep track of everything, like it's quite difficult to do. It's so easy, if you happen to be following on board with someone, to say, well, why is this message from Arvid Lindblad not gone? And it's brilliant. But anyone looking at one's not having to watch them all. And even if you've got them all being monitored, which they have, they've got kind of a degree of automatic transcribing and all these kinds of things, it's still a lot of throughput to look at and put in. So I think we always have to bear that in mind with the coverage as well. Live sports production and broadcasting is not the easiest, particularly when it comes to F1, when you've, at least if you're at on a football field, say, there's a limited number of things to point a camera at and look at, but it's spread over a much bigger area. There's a lot more channels, if you like, to keep an eye on. So I'm not going to kind of completely defend it because I think they're certainly going to be cognizant about trying to present F1 in a good light. But I suspect the first order thing is just a lot of the messages are more procedural and boring, because who wants to, I mean, even just a good example is in qualifying, you used to get more of this, you're losing a little bit in turn 12 compared to your teammates, so maybe try braking a little bit later or braking a bit earlier. But now you're more likely to get, can you add 30 metres of lifting coast before turn 3 and that kind of thing. That's the kind of tuning you're getting. And again, as you said, Nelson, first order problem is just the way the regulations are. And confidence in the product. There's a veneer of confidence, and let's tell everyone this is brilliant. But for the past few months, everything, I think, the way F1 has acted tells me they're not confident in it, because they can see what's happening, even if it's their job to talk it up and put the perfect sheen on it. Some of them will be true believers, but others just know and understand, won't they? So,
and that brings us full circle, because it's drivers like Verstappen who will take that veneer right off.
Absolutely, yeah. You've done a very good job of structuring the podcast there to bring us back to the beginning. That should have been my job, but that's why you're the professional broadcaster, and I'm just a journalist. I'm just a journalist with a microphone, so and allegedly a journalist as well, according to some people. So well, Max Verstappen, he is the person who all eyes are on, and if they make changes before Miami and he were to in Miami say this is vastly better, they've addressed all my concerns, then that's a huge win for Formula One. But I absolutely share the concern you have, Nelson. I just think with the hardware they've got and the limitations, you can't get around this fact that you've got a 4 megajoule battery and you need to harvest more than you need to harvest on a qualifying lap. You need to harvest a huge amount, constant deployment and charging. Those are your laws of physics limitations, and you can't just wish those away in a moment without making big hardware changes. And that's long lead time, big cost implications, very, very big discussions to be had there. But anyway, thanks to everybody who sent in questions. As I say, the Race Members Club, if you want to question us for the future. So hit the link to find out a little bit more about that. But thank you very much, Josh. Thanks very much, Nelson. Lots and lots and lots of podcasts to come in this gap. We've got an endless list of subjects. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.